We got audio.
So hi there. So this is how to fight a war without ever actually starting one. And the talk today is going to be on international law, which sounds incredibly boring. I promise you it is not. We're going to get into exactly how not it is very shortly. First of all, as I mentioned before in my presentation, the trigger warning is cyber. I am not going to drink every time I say cyber. I do not have an alternative because there are names of documents that are important. You are all welcome to drink every time I say cyber. You can all suffer together, or you can suffer together. Three major points to start with. International law matters, but it doesn't always matter in the way that Americans or Europeans would expect it to matter. Because, as we'll get to in a moment, it's not really international and it's not really law in any of the ways that we would conceive of. Second, despite what you're going to hear, NATO didn't start out saying we're going to murder the internet. They just have no idea what the internet is or how it works, and therefore they're going to murder the internet, kind of accidentally. And we really could destroy the whole internet, and I, for one, think that would be bad. So just a side note, I'm Brendan. Hi, I'm a little fast talker. Yell at me if I talk too fast or just ask me to explain what the heck I'm saying. I do security research most of the time. I have a cover identity, though, where I pose as a just about to graduate law student at the University of Wisconsin in Madison. So if you're a law firm and would like to hire me, call. If you're a non-law firm and you'd like to hire me, also call. And if you don't want to hire me, well then that's fine. That guy's shaking his head already, so obviously he has no interest. So let's talk about international law, right? It's not just the guy with the biggest gun, though it often is that. So first of all, the word international. This is what you think of when you think of international, right? The United Nations, right? Everybody's part of it, or most people are part of it, and it's awesome, right? It turns out that's not really how international law works. First of all, we think of the UN as a controlling body, and it's actually not. You have to opt into the authority of the United Nations, and you have to opt into the authority of all these things. Now, the UN is a huge, essentially, peacekeeping operation, so if you don't opt into the UN, then the UN tends to send out bad men with guns, right, to force you to opt in. But that's not the way that most international treaties work. Most of them are really, look, either they're between just you and me, so you're bilateral or few-country multilateral treaties, or they're a broad convention that you have to actually explicitly say, yeah, I want to do that. So if we think about, for instance, there's a convention on landmines that relatively recently happened. And the Convention on Landmines says we're not going to stockpile landmines, we're not going to use landmines, we're not going to suffer fools gladly, right? We're going to stop blowing ourselves up. So you determined that landmines were bad. And some countries have signed it, and the other ones still use landmines. And that's essentially, in this concept, fine. They're allowed to do that. Because when we have international law, it doesn't actually mean you have to follow it. It's not really law either. That's the other cool thing. They're kind of like guidelines. We'll talk about exactly how they're guidelines. One other note before I forget it. Some of you, how many of you are familiar with the Sea Study project? Like 2 people. Okay. There's a bunch of guys who want to buy a cruise ship, tether it in international waters, and start their own country. Have you heard of that? Okay, a few more nods here. One of the cool things about international law is that a lot of it reverts to kind of the law of nature if there's nothing inbound. One example of this is that under some interpretations of the kind of common law of the sea, if a ship of a country encounters a ship flying the flag of another country they don't recognize, they're treated as being pirates. And under the common law, all countries have the right to seize pirate vessels. So therefore, some scholars have said, guys, if you start your own sea study and found your own country and think you're sovereign, the first time one guy with an AK-47 shows up, you lose, because he can be his nation's military. And this is where we get letters of marque and reprisal, and there are all these cool cases, like Supreme Court cases saying, yeah, seizing that ship was a great idea, right? Individual private citizens, in some circumstances, could actually be authorized to take stuff from other people, fly the U.S. flag, and just say, no, that's our ship now. And there are Supreme Court cases talking about who gets the stuff and how it is divided properly, essentially like the way we think of piracy. Right? It's awesome. This is how law works in international law. It is really, do we recognize your status, and do you recognize our status? And if not, we get to have disagreements. So the other problem with this is that there's no enforcement. So let's talk about 2 examples of how enforcement works in international law. One of them is somewhat depressing. My cats are not depressing, but I'm following a friend of mine's lead and including random cat photos in every presentation I make. So, a case called Mexico versus the United States. And you guessed already, Texas caused a problem in international relations. Shocking, right? Meet this guy, Jose Ernesto Medellin.
Yes.
He's a nice, friendly guy. He raped and murdered a couple teenagers. Probably not a good thing. Here's the thing. If you specialize in criminal law, all of your cases are always bad. Miranda, from whom we get the rights that nobody listens to every 45 seconds on cops right before they beat the guy. Miranda was a rapist, and ironically, Miranda, I just learned this, it was great. Miranda died stabbed in a bar fight after a card game gone wrong. The guy who stabbed him was read his Miranda rights. Having been read his Miranda rights and informed of his right to consult with an attorney before testifying, he declined to speak to the officers, later absconded, and has never been seen again. So congratulations, Miranda took a real step for everybody's rights. And this is the good case, right? That's progress in criminal law. So this guy did lots of bad stuff, right? The details are fairly brutal. It's very bad. This guy's a Mexican citizen. He was in Texas illegally. I know this all comes as a shock to you guys. So, and it's very bad and it's very horrible. So Texas found him. He actually gave a full confession, written, oral, everything, right? It's a standard criminal defense lawyer's worst nightmare. So, there's this thing called the Vienna Convention, or specifically the Vienna Convention on Consular Relations of 1967. There are all these conventions. It turns out they're all named after wherever the world's diplomats decided to throw a party at any given point in history. There's like 300 Vienna conventions of different types, actually. There's a few Geneva conventions. There's a whole bunch of Hague conventions. This goes on fairly often, right? So this Vienna Convention on Consular Relations has a whole bunch of important things. Some of them are important to the concept of WikiLeaks and why it was bad when the United Kingdom said, we're going to invade the Ecuadorian embassy in order to get Julian Assange back. That was a bad idea because of this convention. One of the lesser known parts of this convention, which I swear I'm not going to tell you all the boring things this one does, but one of the cool things it does, it says, if you are in a foreign country and you get arrested by the host country, now, again, any host country is a party to this thing, but pretty much everybody's a party to this thing. Countries we haven't done anything other than shoot at for years are still parties to the Vienna Convention. So if you get arrested in a foreign country, the foreign country has to call the U.S. consul. And that's it. It literally just says they have to call the U.S. consul, and the consul has to be allowed to have access to the person incarcerated. To be clear, this doesn't mean you get any special privileges. It means that another guy who's probably also a lawyer or who has friends who are lawyers who work for him get to come see you and said, yeah, dude, you're not allowed to kill people in the United States. I'm pretty sure you couldn't have done that in Mexico either. And that's it. There's no special privileges unless you're a special person in your home country. There's no other rights that go along with this. They literally just have to notify the consulate so that if there's a question of, like, you're from, Eritrea, and you speak a language that, like, no one in the United States speaks, they can find a translator so you can meaningfully participate in your legal rights, right? All good things, very simple, very basic things. So, meet Texas. This is the Texas Chainsaw Massacre pumpkin carving contest. I swear the things that come up when you search for Creative Commons images. Shockingly, what did Texas do? They ignored this. They said, this guy is bad. So heck with him. So they convicted him. They sentenced him to death. He appealed. They said, no, you raped and murdered a couple girls as part of gang initiation. You're very bad. Which he was, let's be clear. And so he exhausted all of his appeals. He's on death row. And then somebody in Texas read a law book and said, my God, they were supposed to notify the consulate. Then they called the consulate and said, did you know about this guy, Ernesto Medellin? And they said, no, who's he? He said, oh, Texas is about to execute him. And they said, oh, this is very bad. So they contacted home, and the Home Department of State equivalent in Mexico said, crap, really? This is the 56th guy this year that's from Mexico that the United States has legally arrested, to be clear, but then illegally convicted and sentenced to die without ever contacting the consulate. And some in places that were not Texas. Some in Washington State, for instance. The guy who's actually the name of the case that Mexico eventually brings was actually in Washington State with a similar kind of story. So Texas sues us. And there's this cool international court in which countries can go to yell at each other. It's called the International Court of Justice. It's in some place none of you guys are going to be able to find on a map because I know how this works. But anyway, it's a court. And it took like 4 years. And the case was Avena and 55 other Mexican nationals. Short title, Mexico versus the United States. And Mexico wins. And they said, no, there's this Vienna Convention. And it's very important that you notify the consulate, and you didn't do that. So you have to vacate the convictions. And the smart little law students at the law clinic in Texas said, God, we knew we were right. This is awesome. We will file a federal action that says that they have to vacate his conviction and then start again. Let's be clear, he isn't just going to walk out. He murdered a couple of girls. And the court said no. Texas said no already. And they appealed all the way to the United States Supreme Court. And in basically the only multilateral action George Bush ever took, this is in 2005, George Bush pled with the governor of Texas to just hold a hearing, which is all they had to do, reaffirming that, yeah, the Mexican consulate doesn't give him anything else. He understood the proceedings. He's a rapist and a murderer. He gets to die. Texas refused. The United States Supreme Court said, suck it. And there was this opinion that said, well, I mean, treaties, they're not that important. And the President of the United States has no authority to enforce treaties, which is one of those cool things. If you read the Constitution, it says that treaties shall be the supreme law of the land. Yeah, next. So, yeah, so what did Texas do, right? Texas had its former governor, now president, pleading with this to stay the execution and hold an actual due process hearing, at which, let's be clear, they were going to be convicted and sentenced him to die again, right? So what happened? Not that. So, executed at 9:57 p.m. on August 5, 2008. At the law school I attend, this is what we refer to as the law in action, as opposed to the law in the books. This is the enforcement of international law, right? It matters. Major scholars wrote very furious letters over canapes, and that was the enforcement, because eventually we were in the United States. That isn't always the way it comes out, though. How many of you guys can locate Antigua on a map?
I've been.
You can locate Antigua on a map?
Buddy.
When you say right there, is it the top island or the bottom island that are marked Antigua and Barbuda?
The larger one.
Is it the larger one? It is actually the larger one, yeah. It's the southern one, though, which confuses a lot of people.
Oh.
So yes, congratulations, you found Antigua on a map. Great. I don't think I might actually not give you a labeled map that you could have done this, right? So, the United States has a gambling problem, which we know, as lots of us have been to DerbyCon, right? Specifically, the United States also has a problem with gambling, right? It's very, very bad. And one of the ways the United States expresses this is that it's illegal under the Congress's powers in interstate commerce to have online gambling. Now, Nevada and I think New Jersey are both trying to do intrastate online gambling, which is a neat trick. We'll see if that happens. But in general, no gambling on the internet. And we're pretty much the only ones in this. I was actually on a panel in Dublin last year where in a very confused Irish bookie, I think they don't like the term bookie, I think the term he liked was general counsel of a major like Fortune 500 equivalent. But bookie works. And he was like, I don't get it. This stimulates the economy. It's a lot of money that they're going to lose anyway. Why don't you guys let each other do it anyway? They shouldn't have to fly to Texas, or excuse me, to Nevada in order to lose their money in gambling. Well, too bad the United States has never agreed. So there's this thing called the WTO, right? And the WTO is not just an excuse for Seattle cops to fire hose hippies, right? Even though that's pretty much what we all think of it. The WTO is the World Trade Organization, and what it does is it exists essentially to remove tariffs and remove what they call non-tariff barriers, which the rest of us know as laws. So the World Trade Organization, you know, like for instance, when like we have a fight with another country and then the other country raises its tariffs on American beef, let's say the European Union, then the World Trade Organization says, stop that, you have to drop your tariffs on American beef. And they say, well, we have laws, and the World Trade Organization says, yes, but you're party to a treaty, so you have to do it. And generally this works out, right? So, in this case, Antigua said, we are a very small island, we have an internet connection, We have companies who would like to provide online gambling services to the United States. They already provide online gambling services to like everyone else in the world. And the United States keeps saying our domestic law prohibits this, and that's not what the World Trade Organization likes. So World Trade Organization, please tell the US to stop it. And they did! The World Trade Organization said, yeah, we don't believe in laws that protect our citizens from foreign corporations, because those would be bad. So you have to stop this. And the United States said no. So there is an enforcement mechanism in the World Trade Organization, but it's not the WTO Army, also known as the Seattle Police, right? The World Trade Organization has a kind of a cool thing. They say they authorize something called retaliation, which is just as cool an idea as it sounds. Right? Imagine if a guy hacked your laptop while you were standing on stage. Don't. And in response, I get to punch him in the face. That's how the WTO works. It's like a playground. It's wonderful, right? But here's the problem. Usually retaliation is something like raising your tariffs, to really high levels. For instance, I mentioned the American beef to Europe thing. So in response to that, and some of you may have seen this in the news, the United States raised to 100% its tariff on French cheese. So briefly, a whole bunch of people had a whole bunch of very expensive cocktail parties who were furious over this issue, right? If we don't have brie, what are we going to do? We'll have to have American brie, which is highly inferior, right? But Antigua, the problem is, of course, tariffs hurt your domestic citizens. That's what we found out about the cheese thing. We didn't care with the cheese thing, but the United States makes a lot of things. Antigua, being a very small island, needs a lot of things the United States makes. Like, well, what can we retaliate on that will hurt the United States and then won't hurt our domestic citizens? And they came up with this really neat idea about something the United States has gone around the world screaming its head off about how important this is to them and how angry they are when anybody else violates it. Antigua is setting up a government-run online juarez site. They have decided that within the Board of Antigua, they will nullify United States intellectual property protections. And it looks like the World Trade Organization is going to say, yeah, go ahead. There's some last-minute appeals, but this is basically kosher, right? International law is awesome. This is the greatest thing ever. Piracy is an awesome, awesome answer to the problem. So this is international law generally. So you get a sense of basically like how messy the system is, right? Like this is the solution, which between two countries that are both relatively civilized, right? Antigua much more so than we are. So, wow, right? So let's talk about war law. So there's a bit of Latin down the bottom. How many of you guys are Latin nerds ever? How many of you guys are Trekkies? Do you remember DS9 episode called that? No. No, none of you guys are real Trekkies. DS9 was by far the best. I will stand on my soapbox, dang it. Inter arma enim silent legis is a principle that's been around for centuries. It says, in time of war, the law falls silent. No, actually. In time of war, we have a whole bunch of laws that specifically apply to war. The Latin term, because in international law, everything is still in Latin because nobody speaks the same language anyway, so Latin is just as intelligible to everybody as English, right? And so the term for the war, or the law that applies in war is jus in bello, the law inside war, as opposed to jus ad bellum, which is the law of how you go to war. So there is a lot of war law. But I already said there's no code and there's no law, right? So how does this happen? Well, we have things like the Hague Conventions and the Geneva Conventions and other conventions named after places that a bunch of diplomats threw a really good party for a few years. And what these do is, again, they're all opt-in, with the slight exception I'll talk about in a minute. But these conventions say you have to not do certain things. They tend to be very just restrictive as opposed to prescriptive. It's not you have to fight wars like this. It's you have to not fight wars like this other way. So one of these, the standard Geneva Convention thing, is you can't shoot prisoners of war. And the reason you can't shoot prisoners of war is because the Geneva and Hague Conventions say you can't do that. Now, they also do things like define war, which is actually kind of an interesting perspective, because the United States, as you all know, has also defined war in increasingly weird ways. But they define war as when a country attacks another country. So when two countries love each other very much, that has certain problems. The United States interestingly demonstrated many of those problems when we just declared our war on Al-Qaeda, because Al-Qaeda is not a state, and so some of these protections don't apply. There's a whole semester long if you want to sit and talk with me over a drink. But suffice it to say, they define war, hot country-on-country action is basically what a war is. This is the main source. So there's no place you can look up in like the code and so, okay, so like law of war, big volume, thunk. Okay, now let's look to weapons, okay, cool, weapons. Now let's look to bad weapons, cool, okay, now let's look to chemical weapons. Okay, so what constitutes a chemical weapon? There's no book like that, right? There is a book for U.S. domestic law. Almost every country has books like this. United States domestic law is something like a bookshelf stretching from that pillar all the way to this corner. It's a huge bookcase full of books, but it is a set of books. And you can look them up. Instead, we just have lists of documents. And if you want to become an international lawyer, you just get to read all the documents, and hopefully you find the thing you're looking for, or you don't, right? So it's occasionally hard to tell when some things are illegal. But the cool thing is that we have nerds who sit around and do nothing except write books on the law of war and how it applies to certain things. We'll talk about one of those in a minute. There's one exception. I mentioned there's an exception. That's what's called customary international law, which is basically what happened in middle school. So imagine you did something, and all of your friends said, no, that's not okay, dude, right? And they all unfriended you, right? They're just like, no, we're all going to ritualistically turn our backs, right? That's kind of how customary international law works. What it says is even if we don't have a treaty on a particular point, if everybody agrees that this is not okay and has been treating this as not okay for a long time, then it's going to be the law. So this is a slight exception, to the concept of you have to opt in. So one example of this would be the Chemical Weapons Convention. Syria, until about a week ago, had never signed or ratified the Chemical Weapons Convention. This means that the Chemical Weapons Convention doesn't apply to Syria under the standard theory of international law. They don't have to not gas their civilians, right? Except for, there are other reasons that they might not be able to. But scholars have said for years, look, everybody's been treating chemical weapons as verboten since World War I. So if somebody does this, it'll be illegal under customary international law. And therefore, the United Nations Security Council could justifiably argue that we should go ahead and bomb the hell out of them. So that's kind of how customary international law works. It's very fluid. There's a cool thing called persistent objector status, which literally means that a country has to, every year or so, go to the UN and say, I still think that rule's crap, and I'm still not going to follow it. So it doesn't get to become custom this year, which is just as silly as it sounds, right? Like, we generally know that the powers who don't like the law aren't going to like the law, but that's fine. Other thing to mention, war crimes. The things that everybody thinks are war crimes are not war crimes. All a war crime is you're in a war and you broke the law of war. So for instance, again, the Syria thing. Barring some complications, that probably isn't a war crime because there could be credible arguments made that wasn't a war. Because a war is hot country-on-country action, right? Now, there are protocols, I'm oversimplifying a few things. But basically, just because you killed a whole bunch of people doesn't make it a war crime. That's also important because, like, there are lots of things that are illegal to do in war, that are not illegal to do the rest of the time. So, for instance, let's say I don't like that guy over there, just because I don't like his beard. So I shoot him with a hollow point bullet. That would be a war crime if and only if we were at war. Because the law of war says you're not allowed to use hollow point bullets.
What's wrong with my beard?
I just random. It's okay.
What happened to respect them on ponytail guys?
Exactly. Can I give you a drink? Will that make up for it? So that's the thing. So war crimes have to occur in war, which is kind of an important point. It doesn't just mean you killed a whole bunch of people. What that would be, what in international law is still hilariously called brigandry, right? That is, I'm a roving gang of thugs, which would explain how big a kill it takes to get around my whole gang. And I've gone and done something of organized crime. That's not a war crime. It's important to do that. So you can have a crime against humanity, that's not a war crime. Genocide is often not a war crime, though it is still a crime against humanity. So one good example of this, of things that people wouldn't think of a war crime. There's a guy, guy's in the army. Guy's with a bunch of other guys, right? He's like a lieutenant, an officer. And he's driving towards Baghdad in Iraq. This is when we were invading Iraq, and Iraq was still fun and cool on CNN, right? And his Humvee breaks down. And he goes, crap. Sergeant, see that truck over there, that random guy? Yes. Take that truck. And the sergeant goes over to the guy and says, okay, we're going to take your truck now. And like, we have lots of guns and you're not going to fight us, right? The guy says, yeah, there's obviously nothing I can do, so here's the keys, right? And they drive away. That was a war crime. But not for the reason you think. The reason it was a war crime was not that they took the truck, it's that they didn't give him a receipt. Because in the law of war, you can take stuff as you occupy a country from the occupied people, but you have to give them receipts so that they can get it back at the end, or so that you can pay them compensation. So it was a war crime. So how do we enforce this war crime? Right? I mean, this is a farmer. He has no way to enforce this. Well, there's several different ways we enforce war law that are important. One of them is that we enforce it internally through court-martials, right? Nobody else, because Iraq was in no position to enforce this, but we just internally said, you know what, this was dickish. Let's make the guy not lieutenant anymore. So he had to go spend a couple of years in Leavenworth, and now he's out, right? Dishonorably discharged because he committed a war crime. He didn't kill anybody there, didn't do anything, kill anything illegally, but he committed a war crime, and so he's out. That's how most of the law of war is enforced. There's also this cool thing called interbelligerent communications, which really happened, where, imagine you've got a small patrol boat, right? So there's like 50 Germans on this small ship. This is a service ship, not a submarine. And they pull up to one of the largest ships in the universe, a hospital ship owned by the Allies. And they say, hey guys, we thought we'd come aboard to make sure you're not smuggling anybody. Would that be okay? And they said yes. Because if they didn't, they'd blow up the hospital ship. This is called interbelligerent communications, and it works amazingly well. If you have two countries who have some vague semblance of respect for each other, they can enforce the law of war so that they know that the hospital ship isn't smuggling guns, and then that the Germans aren't going to blow the hospital ship up. Everybody gets to be okay. And the reason we do this is because it's important that we have something to return to. If we have a history where we say, you know, God, the Nazis blew up our hospital ships as a usual practice, and then they machine gunned the survivors and executed the prisoners of war, why would we ever have a peace treaty with them? Why would we ever have any peace treaty with anyone who'd ever done something like that? We would proceed and proceed and proceed. We wouldn't stop at Berlin. We'd salt the earth. We'd never allow another person on the planet to speak German ever again, because there'd be nothing left to return to. And I think interbelligerent communication is the perfect example of why that's a bad idea. We want to, look at our relationships with Japan and Germany now. We have really good relationships, good for everybody. They're both WTO members. They presumably will steal from Antigua, right? It'll be great. So we have this kind of law because it's important. We can also enforce it with war crimes tribunals. That sucks and takes decades. No. This was a thing, just as a slight side of what I was just saying. Not everybody thinks we should have this law of war. Like, it's a war, they're Nazis, let's kill them. Yeah, okay, let's kill them. Let's follow the rules. And the rules are not just rules for gentleman's conduct in combat. This really is Dr. Seuss. Dr. Seuss was a raving jingoist who wrote editorial cartoons almost every day of World War II. You can look them up all online. They're amazing. But it's not just, well, we've gotten bricks thrown at us, and so, we're going to throw away the old book, which is what it says, right? We don't do these things because we don't get to have a civilization if every time we have a dispute that gets too out of hand, we salt the earth. We don't do this. So finally, at very long last, why is this all applicable to hackers? Well, there's this city in Estonia called Tallinn. Does anybody know why Tallinn is important to the history of hackerdom?
Russians attacked it, took up the banking system.
Exactly. It was the first hot nation-on-nation action of cyber warfare. We're going to have to use it because that's what they use. Okay? So NATO set up a think tank in Tallinn. Specifically, this think tank, NATO CCBCOE. Now, it's not part of NATO, as they will tell you. I mean, they say NATO right there, and they're funded by all the people who fund NATO, but they're not in the NATO chain of command, and they're technically not funded by NATO. It's just that if you're a NATO member, you also have to fund these guys, right? It's like the world's most backwards protection racket. This is who did this. They spent 3 years sitting in Tallinn saying, I think there are probably rules that say that Russia can't just blow up Estonia's banking system, right? And I realize most Americans can't find Estonia on a map, but I promise, it's a real country. They have cool rights. Internet is a fundamental protected right, the way we have free speech or life here. So,
I was just going to say I can find it.
Okay, so there are, I'm sorry to be drawing broad generalization. Most people would know Estonia if they hit it with their face, right? But just saying, a few people can. It's a first world country. It's, has an advanced banking system. It has an advanced computer system. Like I said, internet is a fundamental right, like water. So it's important that they, got attacked. And so like, well, we're not sure we have any law that applies to this. We've got the Geneva Convention. They talk about things like, honest to God, actual Geneva Convention, you have to provide, I believe it's 2 packs of cigarettes to a prisoner of war every day. Otherwise, you've committed a war crime. And again, the fact that that seems a little outdated because nobody smokes anymore doesn't mean that the whole treaty is outdated. It means that it had parts, okay, so they'll get the cigarettes and they just won't smoke them. Who cares, right? They're not going anywhere until the end of the war. The rest of the Geneva Convention says things like you're not allowed to light civilians on fire, or you're not allowed to use blinding weapons. Like you're not allowed to use blinding lasers on the battlefield to blind your enemies. Similarly, there's a whole white phosphorus issue with the United States Marine Corps and Geneva Conventions, but that's a longer story. So these things apply, but they don't really know how because nobody had ever sat down and think about it. So we need to think about law. Who do we hire? We hired a bunch of lawyers. This is totally, search barrister on Flickr. This is what you get, honest to God. It's a law school thing. Specifically, we hired 12 international expert lawyers in international law, right, from all over the world, lots of the NATO member states. And we did hire 2 people who did tell us what computers were. They're both academics you've never heard of from Europe. So that went about as well. So we got 12 lawyers, a whole bunch of support staff working for 3 years, and we've got 2 hackers sitting on the side. We also have observers. Now, an observer is ordinarily reserved to be things like the International Committee of the Red Cross, for instance. They like to observe this kind of process, and this is just a scholarly process. Understand, this isn't a treaty. Just nerds sitting in a room for 3 years. And they had official observer status, and that's great. You know what else went official observer status? Cyber Command. A colonel from Cyber Command sat in on all these meetings. Of course, now we know that NSA just tapped the whole thing, and it was just kind of pro forma. We had to pretend we were just tapping the whole thing. So a colonel sat in the Cyber Command. So here's what they came up with, and this is the crux of the talk. A cyber operation constitutes a use of force, that is an act of war, when its scale and effects are comparable to non-cyber operations rising to the level of a use of force. Now just read that again. And then they went on in the comment section to say that there is no definition of use of force. So we defined it, not only have we defined it circularly, we defined it in terms of a circular null. Nice job, guys. But hey, they had clarifications that they also put in the comments. So the rules that they came up with on Tallinn are very, very short, followed by pages and pages and pages of commentary for each one. Here are some of the cool other things. Turns out, the higher the common criteria about assurance level, the more likely it is that it's a use of force. So if I hack your EAL7 formal system proven computer system, that's almost definitely an act of war. Whereas if I just pop root shell on your Windows PC, even if it's on the president's desk, that's probably not a use of war. It's also less invasive to attack anything ending in .com than it is to attack anything ending in .mil, which is awesome for a whole bunch of reasons, not least the use of force by a nation state against civilians. But it's not going to be invasive, even if we do it against civilians, they went on to say. They said that if you can evaluate how bad the damage was, it's more likely that it's a use of force than if you can't evaluate the use of force. Can't evaluate how bad the damage was. I can't tell if he's yawning or horrified. Oh, he's horrified. Cool. Okay, just check. If you're yawning at this point, I'm going to be like, God, kill me. No, it's important, right? This is terrifying. Who let the common criteria evaluators define war, right? But here's the very best part. Though invasive, cyber espionage does not rise to the level of use of force. So that's everything, right? Everything we do is a use of force. Essentially, the summary is that if you don't kill someone, because that's what they talk about. They talk about it has to be damage equivalent to a kinetic operation. So if you don't kill anyone, like you would with a bomb, then it's not a use of force. Well, that's kind of awesome, because that means if it's not a use of force, then it's not an act of war. So that means we can do all this cool stuff, and as long as it's digital, it won't be an act of war, and they won't be able to go to the UN Security Council and say they did war on us, and we don't going to invade them, and we're going to bring democracy to them. What? We had 12 lawyers sitting for 3 years. Do you know how much a lawyer costs? We paid them billions of dollars, and this is all they came up with? So let's talk about a few things that wouldn't be covered, that might come to mind. This is not an act of war. You guys not know that this is Travis Goodspeed's app, Friend Finder app? Go Google APT Friend Finder. But globalized espionage and attacks to the economic infrastructure, like what happened in Tallinn, are not covered by the Tallinn manual. That's like not talking about what your car does in the car manual. It's an amazing concept. So other things as part of espionage. How many of you know that OSX, fairly uniquely, has 2 Department of Defense signed roots of trust in its key store? One guy. So that means that without any popping of boxes at all, the Department of Defense can imitate VeriSign, not go to VeriSign and demand its keys and all the kind of NSA level stuff. Just sign it using the same signature they use to sign the CAT cards, the military ID cards, and run them in the middle on the whole world's internet connection in front of anybody who has OSX. They get the Windows guys the other way, another way. And that won't be an act of war. Even if they then use it to spy on the entire European Union, it won't be an act of war under this definition. That's kind of awesome. Here's another awesome one. Kaminsky and Tony Capella both demonstrated a internet-level rerouting the whole thing at the same conference at the same time, which is a little bit unfair because Tony Capella is also a really cool guy, and Dan Kaminsky's "I blew up DNS and it ended the world" overshadowed the "I'm a random sysadmin and it blew up the world" thing. But Tony Capella was able to actually send out a BPF packet that said, you know what, just give me all of YouTube's traffic. You know the thing that happened accidentally in Pakistan where they retook all of YouTube? We can just do that on the fly and we can actually reroute it so it's transparent, so you'd never notice that YouTube was down if we did that. Here's the cool part. 1, let's say that as part of a legitimate military operation, as part of a declared war, I, country A, have decided that I don't like that guy's nuke sub. And the nuke sub is on the Wi-Fi, because let's just say it's on Wi-Fi. I don't handle your routing problems. Just put the sub on Wi-Fi, right? I used to work for military research. Put the sub on Wi-Fi would not be as crazy as some of the things I did actually here. So he's got a Wi-Fi enabled sub. So I am sending packets, I'm going to pop root on his box, and I'm going to melt down his nuclear submarine. Legitimate act of war. There's some environmental things, but basically legitimate act of war. Random country C, this guy who looks about 12, goes, you know, I don't want to make Brendan a war criminal. And so he applies a Kaminsky rerouting, or a Capella rerouting, just slightly different how they work. And now the nuclear reactor I'm attacking is a civilian power station. And when it melts down, it kills 100 million people. So who committed the war crime, exactly? I blew up the thing. Are the civilians legitimate collateral damage? Did this guy commit a war crime? He changed the routing thing. He might have done it accidentally. We have no idea, because it's not a use of force unless somebody dies. And it's not an illegitimate use of force against civilians unless we accidentally do it against civilians. Well, this is terrifying, right? Here's another cool thing. It turns out that it's illegal when prosecuted a war to drive tanks through Switzerland or any other neutral power. Right? Anything neutral in a particular conflict, you can't use their territory. Otherwise, they're not really neutral. The internet is just a series of tubes, right? It's not a big truck. So what if I just reroute your stuff transparently? You'll never even see it because it relies on a foreign network through Switzerland. Every one of your attacks now is a separate and indictable war crime that we could then hold a war crimes tribunal and indict you for. And you didn't even do it. That's kind of awesome, right? So the problem is, since we've done this, Well, actually, let me talk about one more thing. Fire sales, because that's totally legitimate. In Charles Frost's Halting State, if you haven't read it, go read it. We could attack the financial infrastructure, we could attack the routing infrastructure, we could start blowing up dams as long as nobody cares, and as long as it wasn't as much of a blown up dam as we would have gotten if we dropped a bomb on it, until it becomes a kinetic equivalent level of power destruction. That is, until we blow the Three Gorges Dam to about 500 million people. It's not going to be an act of war. Well, why would that be bad, right? Well, here's the thing, and this is the thing that the United States hasn't had to remember for a little while, but I think we need to now in the concept of the internet. It's something a friend of mine found out when he was about 8. He grew up in Serbia, and it turns out, which was part of Yugoslavia at the time, very political statement, but let's just say, it was on a map, if you look for Serbia, it would be inside Yugoslavia. It turns out that even if you are personally not fighting a war and have no interest in a war, having a war fought pretty much in your hometown has a lot of effects on you. It makes it hard to do things like go to work, or use the internet for porn, or anything. He was 8, so I suppose he didn't do that, but nonetheless. Civilians are collateral damage in many consequences. You've heard this happen in pretty probably, let's pretend, legal wars, right? Like, we invaded Iraq. Let's pretend that on face was a legal war for a second. Then, as part of the legal war, we drop a bomb in a place, and we kill a few civilians. That's understood to be part of war. We have laws of war, things like targeting and distinction and command responsibility, to protect civilians as much as possible, but collateral damage is an actual thing that's allowed to be determined by the targeting entity. That is, sometimes we know we're going to blow up civilians as part of dropping bombs on places. And it can happen entirely innocently. One particularly cool example was that we dropped a bomb on a building that only had one sniper in it. So kind of overkill. We're allowed to do it, right? This was in Iraq. And they went through all the calculations on how big a bomb it takes to blow up this big a building. They dropped the right-sized bomb and hit it precisely. It flattened 9 blocks because of a miscalculation based on differences between Iraqi building codes and American building codes. So we killed a whole bunch of civilians. That wasn't illegal under the law of war. It just happened. It was very sad. They were very sad. Remember how Stuxnet got into hospitals but allegedly didn't cause any damage? Imagine if that's every single day on the internet. You could infect it with a military-grade attack because you're collateral damage. Let alone what happens when the NSA comes to you and says, as they did on Wednesday, that they require the ability to spy on American citizens, otherwise it's going to be like Yemen in here. That's what they said. We're allowing everybody to use the internet as just a free fire zone, which means that ultimately things we all care about, like our banks and our jobs and our siblings, are going to get killed in the crossfire, even literally. They might actually die when you knock out all the generators that power a hospital. And it's a war crime if you intended to do it, but if they're just collateral damage, if it's just, whoops, we forgot to put in all the extra checks into Stuxnet so that it actually, so that it actually doesn't go off if it's in a hospital, I guess it just happened, right? They were collateral damage, which is chilling when, what's that guy's name? The guy, the Oklahoma City bomber. Tim McVeigh, thank you. I had mixed something, and I knew it wasn't McDonald, and I was confused. It's chilling when Tim McVeigh describes children as collateral damage. But this is what the nation's militaries do all the time, because they have to. Because we're in situations where bad men with guns surround themselves with good people without guns, and sometimes we have to blow up that because it's a nuclear weapon. Assuming it really was a nuclear weapon, we have to drop a bomb on it because we have to make them not set up a nuke, and we're going to kill people, and that's incredibly unfortunate, but that is often how war works. But the internet doesn't have boundaries. It doesn't have nice, easy distinctions like that. So we end up in a situation where we're all going to be collateral damage. We're all going to learn the same lesson that my friend learned at 8. He said, we're all going to learn it right now and on an ongoing basis because we've written the Tallinn manual to say, totally fine, guys. So what are we going to do? Well, one thing, and this is one step. Remember I mentioned customary international law before? It turns out that if all the countries get together and say, this is a lie, we're not going to tolerate this anymore, they can just change the law, especially because Holland is in a treaty. Holland is just nerds sitting in a room. We could fix this by essentially convincing, on a globalized basis, everybody that this was a really bad idea. The problem is we're all too hopped up on this cyber war is coming and it's awesome because we can attack China thing. And we end up a lot like this. We end up with a bombed out amusement park. Except that that's fortunate. Okay, that's probably not a good example. Where's a place people play video games on the internet? I don't know, Steam. Imagine if Valve became a casualty of war. Thousands of 13-year-olds who shoot you in the head all the time would go, how dare you? Because they're not used to living in a war zone. So this is ultimately why international law is important. It's important because with no fanfare at all, we released an incredibly important document that says that the world's greatest minds, arguing for 3 years, decided that no blood, no foul was a good idea, not just something your coach says. And they applied it to the internet. And now we have the military doing horrifying things all over the internet. This is why no one's saying, you violated our sovereignty, when we find out things like the NSA spied on the United Nations or spied on the European Council. Because they didn't. Because they all got together, all the NATO powers got together, and decided this was all going to be okay. So we've ended up in a situation where the militaries are all complicit in this. And now when we have military spying, look, the book says we could do it. We can change the book. But the countries have to agree to change the book. So it means that we have to agree to change the book. And that's hard. We can't just be doomed, can we? Thank you.